Hi, and welcome to Mexilux. NAFTA. We've had it for a generation. Strangely enough, it's not a big topic yet in this year's Mexican presidential election campaign, but really NAFTA is what is shaping behind the scenes the whole debate in the terms of austerity, low wages, dependence on the United States. And today we have the pleasure to have an expert on NAFTA here with us, Dr. Richard Roman, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto and is also an associate fellow at the Center for Research in Latin America and the Caribbean at York University in Toronto, and is the co-author of this book, Continental Crucible, Big Business, Workers, and Unions in the Transformation of North America, which has just been released in Spanish under the title of La Gran Cazuela en América del Norte. We'll get that video up, that image up for you there coming up. So, Dr. Roman, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Right. Okay, Dick, what we want to start with is really the question of origins. I mean, in the book you argue that NAFTA, despite what some people in Mexico might think, was very much a common project of the state and big business. It was, you describe it as a Bill of Rights for capital. Mm-hmm. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, NAFTA has to be understood in relation to the corporate offensive, the capitalist offensive that started in the late 60s and 70s in Canada and the U.S., and in Mexico a bit later, in the 80s. And really many of the things that we blame NAFTA for started before NAFTA. The attack on the social net, the attack on workers' rights, the attack on unions. NAFTA has deepened that, consolidated it, extended it, and you could say constitutionalized it. In fact, the one of the main negotiators from Mexico in the NAFTA negotiations was very clear in saying that NAFTA was a means of consolidating the domestic transformations. So NAFTA has to be seen as a domestic policy, one very important weapon strategy in the broader corporate offensive. In the case of Mexico, there had long been an organization called MEXUS, Mexico-US, association of business leaders in the two countries that was pretty dormant until after '82. The Lopez Obrador, no, wrong Lopez. Lopez Portillo nationalization of the banks upset the Mexican capitalist class. They never, much of the class was never happy about the heavy role of the state, but this really upset them, and they really began to get their act together. They formed a new organization called the Mexican Business Association, which was really run by an older, smaller group of the top 30, 40 Mexican richest people. MEXUS, which had been a dormant organization, became very vibrant and played a very important role in the formation of NAFTA, along with the big business peak organizations that developed in the 70s in the US and Canada. The Business Roundtable, it started in '72 in the US. The association, perhaps the most important association of the top 100 or so CEOs in the US. The Business Council on National Issues, now called the Business Council of Canada, was explicitly modeled on that. And so Mexico really became on board the Mexican capitalist class and the Mexican regime, which was becoming more and more integrated with the Mexican capitalist class as power was growing. The long period of statist development of the PRI strengthened the capitalist class. It was asserting itself more. Plus, the important groups in the PRI were themselves becoming influenced by neoliberalism as in the whole world. So so I guess the main point to make is that NAFTA was not an imposition of the U.S. on Mexico, but NAFTA was an imposition by U.S. capital, Mexican capital, Canadian capital on Mexico, but also on the U.S. and Canadian workers and popular sectors, which I guess we'll talk about later.
Well, we're going to talk about that right now because one of the points you make out, when negotiations actually got underway, no labor groups, no environmental groups, no civil society groups were invited to the table. So tell us about the impact of NAFTA on the Mexican working class in particular, because I think a lot of times, and you hear this argument in Canada all the times, oh yes, but they're much better off now because they have higher paying jobs in the maquiladoras than they would have working on the land in Oaxaca or some other poor part of Mexico. So tell us about the impact on the labor force and the working class in Mexico.
Well, again, I would emphasize that it wasn't only NAFTA, but changes that were made by the Mexican capitalist class preceding NAFTA, but it was, of course, also NAFTA that deepened it and consolidated it. The Mexican working class, like the U.S. and Canadian working classes, have been devastated. There have been job gains, but there's also been massive job losses, because part of the policies that preceded NAFTA and were expanded with NAFTA was the opening of the economy and the cutting back of subsidies to industry and the agricultural sector. So really, and the devastation of domestic industries that were being protected by tariffs and other policies that were mainly located in the center of the country. In many ways, what happened in Mexico was like what happened in the U.S. Rust Belt, Northeast, Midwest, a deindustrialization of regions and a new industrialization of other regions under even worse working conditions. We went from very terrible working conditions to much worse working conditions. With even less union representation in the northern regions where the maquiladoras were developed. And in fact, the policies, the destruction of labor rights and phantom unions, phantom contracts in the maquiladora regions became much more common throughout Mexico.
Right. And this leads us in a way directly to a third theme that we wanted to talk about, and that's migration, because while some workers migrated northward to work in the finishing plants in the maquiladoras, many more migrated across the frontera into the United States. And I was really struck in your book that you make a kind of counter-argument to a lot of common sense assumptions about the impact of migrant workers. For example, you argue that between 2000 and 2008, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the cheap migrant labor coming across the border was key to sustaining the economic boom in the United States. And you know, there's some other points that you make around that actually migrant labor, because of its cheapness and because it's largely not a burden on the state in the United States, has a real beneficial effect for the American economy.
Yes, migrant labor did sustain that boom, but also migrant labor generally involves a subsidy to to the receiving country because it doesn't pay any of the cost of reproducing labor.
Right, yes.
The laborers are socialized, educated, brought up in another country at the expense of the people of that country, of the government of that country. So they come as ready to work workers in the U.S. So that's one subsidy. The other subsidy, their number, and given their vulnerability, their legal precariousness in the main, it's much more easy to prevent them from having unions, to keep wages down, to pay illegally low wages and have terrible working conditions. There's also another subsidy that's very interesting, and that is the subsidy to the Social Security system.
Right.
Because many of the migrant workers, in order to work in the U.S., have to get fake Social Security cards. Their money, and their employer will deduct payments for Social Security that go into the general fund of Social Security, but they will never receive any money back from that. So there are different ways in which migrant labor is contrary to being a drain, is a subsidy to the U.S. or whatever receiving government.
Right, and you make that point that Mexico has become the leading exporter of people in the world as a result of NAFTA, this
Yes,
constantly flowing
Yes.
source of very cheap labor, which is now completely integrated, not just into the circuits of production, but completely integrated into a kind of continental workforce.
Right.
You say something like 58% of employed Mexicans are employed either in the U.S. or in Mexico, and that
For U.S. business.
For U.S. business,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's true. Mexico really, the Mexican labor force, the Mexican working class, is a binational working class. It straddles the border. It exists on both sides with many interconnections. We're in Oaxaca right now, and it's so true of Oaxaca.
Yeah.
There's so many family links back and forth. I'm always impressed with one out of every 5 waiters I speak to wants to use his English with me because they've worked in the U.S. for X years, 1 year, at a tremendous cost to their lives. Often separation from families for much of the year. It's very, very sad. It's and that is both a tragedy and a high cost. Though parts of it for young people may also be an adventure, but it also may provide some possibilities. We argue in our book and elsewhere that some possibilities for a cross-border fertilization of ideas and struggles, etc. That's happened to some degree in 2006.
Yeah. That's the final theme I want to talk about.
Yes.
Perfect
lead-in. That's a perfect lead-in.
What a segue.
Wow. Thank you.
Which is, I think for all of our lights, in some ways, the most interesting question is what you call continental integration from below. That is to say, how we build the complexities and the possibilities of building solidarity across borders. Not just amongst Mexican workers on both sides of the borders, but Canadian American workers also on those sides of the borders, because I think we all recognize that while capital is very organized and integrated, not so much the case with the labor movement and the working class. So I'd like you to talk about some of those complexities and the possibilities of solidarity, if you would.
One of the really interesting things that struck me about Canada, U.S., Mexico, U.S., is the binational character of the Mexican working class, which I just mentioned, and the binational character of U.S.-Canadian unions. Many unions in the private sector are international unions. They're not socially very connected. I mean, the so-called international unions, U.S.-Canadian unions, tend to be very bureaucratic, formalistic organizational links. It's not like the Mexican binational class, which people are linked by family, community, etc. But those two links could be a potential, could create a potential synergy for the development of a continental working class or labor movement. However, there are many obstacles, and one of the biggest obstacles is the conservatism of these international unions. They're very stuck in old economistic ways of resisting capital section by section.
Right.
They're also stuck in competitive nationalisms where they make deals with their own capitalists, often the same ones that another government is making a deal with, make deals to try to keep jobs here rather than there, and they even fight for subsidies from their governments for these deals. In other words, they often pit themselves against. So one of the biggest obstacles is the unions and transforming them.
Yeah.
And that's an essential prerequisite for not only a continental struggle, but for the survival of the unions, which have been beaten down tremendously by neoliberalism and NAFTA. For example, very recently when Trump announced the tariffs on steel and aluminum, Leo Gerard, the president of the United Steelworkers of America, who was a Canadian, Leo Gerard said, "It's great, but we have to exempt Canada because the Canadians are members of our unions." He didn't say a word about Mexico, even though the steelworkers have a kind of on paper pact with the mineros of Mexico, but it's not a. So that's a big problem, and that's a huge issue in and of itself. But on the Mexican side, there's a lot of dynamism in both in the Latino community, the immigrant community, and the Latino community more broadly, and given their importance and growing importance within the U.S. working class, there's a potential for an impact from Latino workers, especially as they're under so much attack by the growing racism of the U.S. regime. There's a potential impact of those Latino workers and other immigrant workers on transforming these unions, some of which are international unions.
Okay, yeah, well, that's great. And the final point, which I thought was very powerful, argument that you make, is that Mexico, in many respects, is key to any new working class insurgency in North America. Because of this very powerful legacy of the Mexican Revolution, these repertoires of popular protest. You really see Mexico as kind of potentially explosive and also the weakest link in the NAFTA chain.
Yes, Mexico is the most politically unstable. In fact, I would argue that the regime's been in a long-term crisis of legitimacy.
Absolutely.
It hasn't been able to, well, it's gone through a neoliberal transformation and the demise largely of one-party rule and the old centralism of one-party rule. It hasn't been replaced by a new legitimacy, new hegemony, and things that are very unstable. And I don't think they will be stabilized for long, even if López Obrador wins the election and it's not stolen from him, because he's going to be faced with incredible dilemmas as to how to deal with the deep crisis of Mexico. I'm not saying his regime won't have a honeymoon period. I think it will.
But it will raise expectations.
It will
right?
raise. That's right. As did the so-called transition in 2000. And so, he's not going to be able to meet those expectations. He's not himself he's not particularly radical.
Yeah.
So I think Mexico is the weakest link. But one of the huge problems in Mexico also is which the U.S. and Canada are not at all exempt from, maybe more so there, is the weakness of the left.
Mm-hmm.
The weakness of the left and the weakness within the workers' movement of an insurgency. I'm not pessimistic that there won't be a resurgence but right now we're in a moment of weakness where, for example, the Zapatistas are very isolated phenomenon from national politics. The union movement is beaten down more than ever, independent union movement,
And Morena, the institutional left, is in favor of NAFTA. They just want to renegotiate.
Yes. So López Obrador has moved more and more to the center in his cabinet picks, with very contradictory cabinet picks. Business, what is it?
Labor.
The seed company, agriculture.
Monsanto
guy,
Yeah.
but also a progressive pick for labor secretary.
Right.
So how that will play out, it's not viable to last terribly long.
But it kind of condenses all the contradictions.
Yeah, talking about political
Absolutely.
schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
condensing the
Yeah.
contradiction is
Yeah.
a very good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
It's
Richard.
Dr. Richard Roman. The book is Continental Crucible: Big Business, Workers, and Unions in the Transformation of North America. We'll get some links up under the video so you can check out both the English and the Spanish version. Thanks very much for being
Thanks
with us.
very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.